Welcome, friends. Welcome to the 51st Dwight and Artis Michener Memorial Lecture. Uh, Today, we will have a presentation by Dr. Petra Doan. Seeking the Seed, Embracing Wholeness, Experiencing the Divine. Dr. Petra Doan has been a Quaker since 1972 and a member of Tallahassee monthly meetings since 1989. She is professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Florida State University, where she has served in various positions, including Department of Urban and Regional Planning undergraduate program director, doctoral program director, coordinator of the Master's International Program, and with the U.S. Peace Corps and interim department chair. Among other endeavors, Petra researches urban planning issues relating to marginalized communities and the LGBTQ community. She's edited 2 books that have been critically acclaimed: Querying Planning, Challenging Heteronormative Assumptions and Reframing Planning Practice, and Planning and the LGBTQ Communities, the Need for Inclusive Queer Space. She is a member of the editorial board of Gender, Place, and Culture and is the elected president of the Faculty Women's Interest Group of the Association of Collegiate Schools Planning. She has received several awards, including Equality Florida's Lifetime Achievement Award 2020, the Dale Prize, California State University, Pomona, the Transformation Through Teaching Award, Florida State University, Spiritual Life Project in 2012, John Boosfield Distinguished Planning Visitor, University of Toronto 2012, the LGBT Educator of the Year, Family Tree, LGBT Community Center 2010, and Senior Fulbright Scholar, Middle East Region 1995-1997, Center for the International Exchange of Scholars in 1995. On a personal note, I haven't known Petra since '72, but I met her, I think, probably sometime about the time I became associated with the Society of Friends in 1985, and it was really a great experience for me to meet with her yesterday and get an understanding of this lecture. Petra will speak to us from silence. Let's gather, friends.
Good afternoon, dearly beloved friends. I am a bit overwhelmed as I see so many people from this dear yearly meeting, from my own monthly meeting, but also from many other chapters of my life. It is lovely to have you here today as my audience. Several years ago, we had an after meeting learning session in which some of us read this quote from Isaac Pennington. And I found myself deeply affected. While I was deeply connected to the seed metaphor, I also felt a strong resonance with the phrases giving over, sinking down, and letting grow. These words provided a wave of insights about my own spiritual and gender journey. There is something so important about trusting the divine and turning over to God those decisions that overwhelm us. But sometimes those of us who stand in such need have the most trouble accessing this support. As I read this quote, I felt a wave of new understanding wash over me. Today, in this time of pandemic and civil unrest, I am sure many of us are deeply concerned about survival of our loved ones, of our beloved democracy, and of the planet itself. Accordingly, it seems like an especially useful moment to unpack these insights and prompt further discussion of how we use our connections with the seed to find paths that are resonant with hope, renewal, and better times to come. Of course, the core of the quote, which I'll read now, give over thine own willing, give over thy own running, give over thine own desiring to know or be anything, and sink down to the seed which God sows in the heart, and let that grow in thee, and be in thee, and breathe in thee, and act in thee. And thou shalt find by sweet experience that the Lord knows that, and loves and owns that, and will lead it to the portion, and will lead it to the inheritance of life, which is its portion. This was Isaac Pennington in 1661, as quoted in the Britain Yearly Meeting, Faith and Practice. Of course, the core of the quote is the idea of the seed which God sows in the heart. As any farmer or gardener can tell you, seeds are a critical yet complex ingredient for growth. For instance, the seed of a longleaf pine is embedded in a cone that is dormant until a wildfire provides enough heat to trigger a new growth cycle. Other seeds, like those of a black walnut, are surrounded by an outer casing that is very difficult to crack. Time will soften the shell and allow the seed to break forth, but interrupting the process to harvest the nut meat inside is very difficult. How do we tend seeds sown by God? How do we soften the hard shell that sometimes surrounds this inner seed that keeps it from growing and guiding us? In what ways have our difficult life experiences contributed to hardening the husks that keep us from sinking down into the seed? My talk today will share a few reflections from my own struggles to sink down and seek the seed. I have learned how important it is to not only tend and soften the shell that protects the seed, but then to follow the leadings that emerge by letting them grow, breathe, and act in myself. Give over thine own willing, give over thy own running, give over thine own desiring to know. Sometimes it is very hard to distinguish between what we are told to feel and believe and the truth of our own insights. When we fail to make this distinction, we can often find ourselves locked in a constant struggle to conform and live up to what we have been told about the ways in which we should live, work, and play. I think the giving over piece of Pennington's quote is partly about this conflict, but it is also a warning that feeding one's ego, because it is very clear that conformity can bring a whole host of material successes and the promise of improved well-being. It is our ego that directs us to desire these benefits. Now, the world in the late 1950s and early 1960s did not approve of or welcome gender nonconformity. And that was made clear to me in many ways, both subtle and overt. The subtle and not so subtle messages are deeply embedded in our cultural expectations about gender and are the mechanisms through which gender norms are constructed. Many people simply accept these norms and go about their everyday lives without giving it another thought. But for those of us who do not experience gender as binary, divided into two dichotomous categories, there is often a powerful dissonance between the socially constructed norms and our lived experience. This was especially true in the mid-20th century when I was born. 10 years earlier, the Second World War had ended, and as waves of GIs returned stateside, they needed jobs, houses, and wives. But the women had gone to work in the factories to support the war effort, and many of them had realized that they could survive very well in the man's world of manufacturing and other well-paid jobs. After the war, women had to be persuaded to give up paid employment to open up jobs for returning veterans. Part of this persuasion required the re-emphasis of traditional values that Gwendolyn Wright has called the cult of domesticity, where women were persuaded to put home and family first, turning away from the more radical gender roles embodied by images of Rosie the Riveter. Women's magazines were filled with photos that glorified domestic bliss, and government policy promoted a new type of housing development, the suburb, in which wives could make homes while men went back to work. I had the misfortune to be born during this reassertion of traditional gender roles. I had little awareness of magazines and housing policy, but I felt the value-laden echoes in supposedly harmless nursery rhymes about girls and boys that also set the standard for expected behavior. I can remember hearing this little verse and feeling somehow cheated. Snips and snails and puppy dog tails, that's what little boys are made of. Sugar and spice and everything nice, that's what little girls are made of. I had no idea what a snip was, but I knew that I didn't want to be associated with slow and slimy snails, and I certainly wanted nothing to do with removing a dog's tail. But sugar and spice? Everything nice? Who wouldn't want to be that? But not for boys. I think I complained to my mother that it felt horribly unfair that boys were supposed to be one way and girls another. Years later, I would describe in one of my articles this experience as the tyranny of gender. My earliest memories involve my cousin Connie. We were born just 4 months apart in 1955 and were like peas in a pod. When I visited her at my grandparents' farm, we would literally play for hours up in her room. She had such interesting toys. I was fascinated with her dolls and loved playing with her in her room. But my very favorite game was playing dress up. In a back bedroom on the second floor, just down the hall from Connie's room, there was a small guest bedroom that contained a box of old clothes, mostly dresses, but some slips and high-heeled shoes. Connie and I, along with my older brother Andy, used to play dress up in that room and prance around pretending to be grown-ups. One time we even went downstairs and did a kind of bizarre fashion show can-can line for our parents and grandparents. Now let me be clear. Most kids enjoy this kind of play acting. But for me, when I put on those clothes, I felt a deep inward stirring, the first emanations from the seed, perhaps. My memory of that moment serves as a kind of epiphany or realization that something was not right. I had this overwhelming feeling that I was supposed to wear clothes like these, women's clothes, all the time. In fact, I wanted to be a girl, not play act as one. Now, where does something like that come from, if not from the divine? But I also knew, even at a young age, that this was not acceptable, and that caused a profound inner conflict within me. Despite this epiphany that I needed to express this differently gendered part of myself, I was also terrified that doing so would put me at risk from those wider social norms that even a 4-year-old understood. My therapist later confirmed for me that if I had told my parents what I was feeling in 1959, they might have taken me to counseling, and the prescribed treatments at that time were chemical aversion therapy and or electroshock treatments, which could have done horrific emotional and physical damage to me. But these broad social norms were enforced in so many other ways. One powerful tool was peer pressure. As a younger brother, I always wanted to tag along with my older brother, Andy, and he was rarely eager for my presence. Sometimes Andy and his friends just played run away from the pesky younger siblings, but at other times, some of them taunted me. I remember one time, Jeff, a friend of my brother's, was pretty harsh in telling me to stop acting like a girl. I think he felt my fingernails were too long or something. Another time, an older boy at school kept taunting me until we got into a fight. During and for long afterwards, he laughed and told me I fought like a girl. At this age, I had not yet learned about Quakers, but this incident made me realize how little was solved by engaging with people like that. But it also reinforced that for the sake of survival, I had to do a better job of shielding my inner feelings. Around that time, I also had a powerful dream that recurred several times. A group of kids were living in the woods in camps, divided into the boys' camp and the girls' camp, and they were engaged in some kind of protracted conflict. One day in the dream, I was captured by the girls, who took me back to their camp. Once there, they put me on a conveyor belt and sent me through the most wondrous machine. When I emerged at the other end, I had been magically transformed into a girl. When the boys found me, they tried to get me to go back through the machine. Come on, go back through the machine. But I reversed. I didn't want to reverse the process. I was so happy right where I was in my newly transformed body. But when I awoke, I realized this was just a dream and that my survival depended on living my life in accordance with social norms, no matter how poorly fitting they seemed to me. A few years later, my cousin Connie was diagnosed with leukemia. And after months of ineffective treatment, she died. I had no idea what had happened, and did not even get to say goodbye. My parents lovingly tried to explain, but I remained in a state of grief and shock for a long time. It was devastating to lose my beloved cousin and dearest friend, the one person who had always welcomed me into her world and never judged me for wanting to play with her things. I think this profound loss was traumatic and probably sealed my inner shell almost completely. But that inner voice still got through when all around me was quiet. Each night, as I lay quietly in bed, I responded by praying, "Please, God, make me a girl." Instead, as I grew taller, older and taller, puberty happened. This onset of adolescence did not quell my desire to be differently bodied, but feeling the growing stubble on my lips and chin did dash any hope that some miracle would send me down a different path. The death of my cousin and the growth of my beard were twin traumas that caused an inner sadness I could not shake. Realizing that I just couldn't continue to give over to my love of girlish things probably resulted in an overcompensation. I found myself exerting my will and began seeking ways to convince the world of the truth of my boyhood and swift appearing manhood. As my body grew even larger and more visibly male, my feelings did not change, but I perfected the ability to hide my inner self. I suppose in doing so, I created an even harder shell around that divine seed, and I got very good at playing parts. When I attended Westtown School for high school, I was drawn to the drama program. I found it was easy for me to take on roles such as King Pellinor or Preacher Hagler in high school plays. Acting didn't feel so different than what I did every day just to survive. But it was also at Westtown that I encountered Quakers for the first time and experienced Quaker meeting for worship. During meeting, I found myself sitting quietly in a place of deep calm and serenity, where I did not have to think about gender, but could feel a deep and abiding love running through the room, connecting all who were present. I think this experience kept the seed from withering completely, even if I remained cut off from its promptings. I also joined the soccer team in high school and went on to play at Haverford as well. I learned a deep love for the game, and I found that physical exertion helped keep my inner conflict at bay. I let my beard grow long and tried to wrap myself in the competition that is such a powerful male element in our society. But for me, it was just another kind of disguise, a new kind of role to play. But I played it well, and I think that almost no one had any idea of my silent emotional turmoil. The only one I was able to confide in was a girl I met at Westtown named Rebecca. We dated for a while, but I wasn't sure what I was and shied away from greater intimacy. Several years later, I was able to confide in her and try to explain my ever-present discomfort with my own gender. But I still couldn't find the right words to explain what was going on inside me, but it was at least a first attempt to give over. After college, I decided to join the Peace Corps and was assigned to Togo in West Africa as a rural development construction volunteer. After I finished working in Togo, I returned to the US and reconnected with Rebecca, who had also just completed her AFSC service in the West Bank in Gaza. We'd been communicating through letters and had several in-person visits, so at that point, we decided to try this relationship thing again. Unfortunately, I was still pretty blocked emotionally, locked up by my fear, though we continued to talk. I finally let her meet my cross-dressed self. At least she didn't run screaming from the room, but I can only describe her reaction as a kind of loving tolerance. I remain grateful for that love, which began a healing process and led into a marriage of 17 years that produced 2 amazing children. Love can heal many things, but it takes a long time to crack a shell. While I was in graduate school studying international development planning, I used to spend a lot of time in the graduate library at Cornell. Much of that time was trying to understand who and what I was. I used to spend hours digging through the stacks to find old articles in journals about transvestites and transsexuals. Most of the articles were by psychologists and psychiatrists who were treating these disorders. And it helped me to realize I was not alone. But it didn't really help me to come to terms with my inner truth because I didn't feel like I had a disorder. But I did begin to realize there was a kind of disorder within me, the conflict between the person I was willing myself to be and the person that somehow I knew I was supposed to be. But I continued to have so much fear that society would never accept who I was, causing me to lose all the family that I loved and all the possible male privileges that come with living as a man in this society. Ultimately, I think this fear made it much more difficult for me to give over fully, though I felt the need to do so. Sink down to the seed which God sows in the heart. The reality of sinking down to the seed is a much more complicated process than I had ever imagined. Rather than a gentle floating down, a fluttering to the center, the sinking process often felt like a result of protracted struggle and internal conflict. The sinking that I felt was more akin to sinking down to the floor in utter exhaustion than a more leisurely settling into that of God. The next section details some of the struggles I had to sink down to the seed, perhaps because I still had trouble with the prior giving over part. I think there was a clear conflict between my desire to do the expected man thing, find a job, support the family, versus allowing myself to come to terms with the glimmers of a truth that I could no longer avoid. But I was so completely absorbed in the struggle that it took a number of messages to get through to me as I strove to sink down. The experience has been messy and full of tears, but it certainly resulted in some of the most profound experiences of my life. A first step in sinking down was trying to let go of my expectations for myself. Finishing my dissertation was a very intense process that left me with very few reserves. In the next few months after I finished, when I should have been turning my dissertation into a book or at least into articles for publication, I found myself instead seeking a transgender support group. I was in Chapel Hill at the time, and I found a support group in Charlotte, North Carolina. And that discovery triggered the first major crack in my inmost shell. Prior to this meeting, I had always felt that given my large frame and very deep voice, I could never seriously be seen as the woman, or at least as the woman that I dreamed of being. I had purchased a mail order wig before the meeting, and it never fit properly on my head. I have a large head, usually requiring the largest hat size possible. At any rate, one of the organizers took one look at this mess of short curls perched atop my head like a beret and took me to a shop called Everything East of the Sun. This emporium was run by a former drag queen who took one look at me and said, "Oh, honey, I can't wait to get my hands on you." She whisked me upstairs to a loft filled with gorgeous wigs, sat me down on a stool, and ripped the too small wig off my head, saying, We've got to get rid of this dead rat. And threw the wig in a corner and stomped on it. She spun my stool, turning my back to the wigs, and spent a minute or two contemplating her collection. Before I knew it, she had selected a wig and was settling it on my head. With a ta-da, she spun me back around to see my reflection in a mirror on the wall. And I gasped to see a woman sitting on the stool looking back at me. I didn't hear the cracking of the shell at that time. But afterwards, after the meeting, I spent several hours sobbing, not from sadness, but from relief, as I began finally to sink down towards the seed. Perhaps the dam of my expectations was breaking, and I had a glimmer that change was possible. Could I do something so daring as to live my truth openly? At this time, I found myself needing a new name. My dissertation research had been in Jordan, and one of my favorite places was the rose-red city of Petra. Now, Petra, the city, was built by the Nabateans over 2,000 years ago and was hidden in the red sandstone cliffs of southern Jordan. The entrance to Petra is through the Seek, which is a mile-long winding passage through a narrow ravine with towering cliffs on either side. After what seems like an eternity, the passage widens a bit, and in the distance is revealed a beautiful city carved into the stone. This real journey to the heart of the city of Petra seemed like an apt metaphor for my own gender journey to reveal myself as a woman called Petra. One of the great blessings of this marriage was the two children that many of you know and love, Jessamine and Daniel. And they have continued to be so important to me at every stage of their lives. However, the responsibilities of parenting added to my turmoil, since I was very much afraid that being true to what was emerging within me would damage them or my relationship to them. In retrospect, I should have known better and trusted in the deep love between us. But at the time, my head was full of accounts of other trans people who were completely ostracized from their families, as well as their spiritual communities after coming out. These stories of rejections only fanned the fears that grew ever stronger. One day in the Tallahassee Meeting Library, I came across a Pendle Hill pamphlet, The Testimony of Integrity in the Society of Friends, by Wilmer Cooper. That opened another crack in my shell. Cooper suggests that integrity has different levels. At one level, integrity is about truth-telling, but he describes a much deeper understanding that left me quite stunned. Cooper's elements are truthfulness, authenticity, obedience to God, and wholeness. Now, I felt like I did pretty well with truthfulness, though, truth be told, even there, I sometimes could not reveal to my colleagues or my children when I took a weekend trip to support group meetings in Charlotte, and later after we moved to Tallahassee, up to Atlanta. But it was the authenticity piece that really stopped me cold. I could not in good conscience say that I was living an authentic life. And perhaps that was the reason that I felt so blocked in my connection to spirit and the seed from which it rises. The first message that came to me was when I was terribly torn about what to do next. One day, using my Nordic track to dull the pain, I felt overwhelmed by what I felt I had to do and just couldn't continue. Suddenly, I heard a quiet voice. Lift it up, Petra. Lift it up. Stunned, I looked around, but I found no one else in the room. But somehow, I no longer felt alone. I realized I didn't need to do this by myself and decided to ask for help from the meeting. Several special friends, Susan Taylor and Catherine Lord, agreed to co-clerk a clearness committee, and Gay Howard, Steve Angel, and Lou Riley agreed to join the committee. This loving group of friends sat with me weekly over the next 6 months, listening to my struggles to reach down to the seed and gently probing my sense of needing to make a change. These well-seasoned friends helped me to realize my kids would never stop loving me for living my authentic self. And certainly the meeting community would be happy to welcome me as well. While this guidance was extremely helpful, they were unable to provide much guidance about the fate of my marriage. I knew I still had to face the difficult issue of whether my marriage could continue if I proceeded with my transition to Petra. Upon reflection, I realized that during the struggle to sink down to the seed, there are many possible missteps and pitfalls. One friend on my clearness committee reminded me that the fruits of the Spirit might provide good guidance along the way. Thank you, Susan Taylor. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. In retrospect, I think if I had more clearly clung to these fruits, I would have been better able to distinguish that which came from the divine and the darker thoughts which came from another source that some might have called the tempter. In hindsight, I realized that learning these distinctions between the divine and the tempter is part of sinking down. Another message that came to me was in worship with a wonderful group of friends known as FLGC at the time, Friends for Lesbian and Gay Concerns, who later renamed themselves Friends for Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer Concerns, FLGBTQC. That's what spirit means to me. I wasn't certain if gay and lesbian friends at this first gathering I went to were ready to welcome a trans Quaker in their midst. But my need was so strong, I decided to risk it. I found such love and support among these beloved friends from across the country that I began to realize that it might be possible to finally emerge. Once during worship, a message arose within me that was full of such deep sadness that I was unable to finish and sat back down in my chair and just wept. I felt a hand on my back and some movement in the room, but I saw nothing through my tears. Finally, my brother Andy, sitting next to me, whispered, "Petra, look up." When I did so, I saw that about half the meeting was gathered behind me, each putting a hand on their neighbor's shoulder, connecting each of them to the single warm and loving hand on my shoulder. Such love made visible sent shivers down my spine and helped me sink down even deeper to the seed. But even so, I needed another message, this time a kind of vision. During another worship with these beloved friends, FLGC, at a midwinter gathering in Front Royal, Virginia, I had a powerful experience that I can only describe as a vision. I wrote it down in a journal afterwards, and I'd like to share it with you here. This is the vision. I walked into meeting for worship a bit tired and not feeling very centered. I sank into my chair and settled into a comfortable position and closed my eyes to begin the process of centering down. As the silence enveloped me, I realized that I was seeing a wondrous technicolor reality unfolding before me. I found myself walking along a clearly defined path through some woods, on what appeared to be a high plateau. The path led to an open space and then straight on to the edge of the plateau. As I approached this space, I realized that I was at the edge of a precipice. Looking carefully over the edge, I saw that the bottom was a very long way down. It appeared to be barren and rather desolate landscape. I turned to look for the path once more, and I realized it went straight up to the edge and then went over the edge. I walked along the path until just before it dropped out of sight, and then peered over the edge once more. It seemed as if the precipice was not so much a sheer cliff as an overhanging rock formation extending out and over the valley floor below. I felt waves of fear rise within me. I remember feeling, I can't do this. I stayed at the edge and wrestled with myself for a while. I'm not sure how I found the courage to move onward, but I think I felt like staying at the edge was just not possible. I finally managed to gather my physical and emotional resources and move slowly forward, one step at a time. Instead of the rapid uprush of wind as I stepped off and fell, I found that as I moved forward, my shoes were gripping the walkway ever so tightly. Within a very short period, I was no longer walking over the edge without a path, but was following some other procedure. You can do that in dreams. Perhaps I was walking on angel's wings. Sure enough, within a few seconds, the path twisted and turned, and I was walking right side up in a gentle downward spiral. When I reached the bottom, I discovered it was not barren or desolate. It was filled with rich colors and lots of interesting textures. This vision showed me that I needed to go over the edge and trust in God that I would find that soft, spiraling path to a better place. But I still resisted. I had also begun seeing a therapist who had prior experience with trans folks, and his counsel was very helpful. He was able to provide only minimal guidance about how to handle the cracks in my marriage, but he said, Petra, your vision is clear. You need to follow your path. But I remained deeply depressed, not wanting to give up the partnership with a woman I had loved for nearly 20 years, but also wanting to respect her own sense that she did not wish to be married to a woman. I fell back into a deep depression and began having suicidal thoughts where I would fixate on ways I might end this agony. Two things kept me going. Knowing that I would not deprive my children of one of their parents, and finding solace in listening to classical music. After one especially powerful bout with depression, I soothed my pain with the Fauré Requiem and emerged from that experience to write a dark poem about my struggles. I share this poem to provide some examples of the struggle I experienced in sinking down to the seed. I call the poem Dancing with Death. Some days I spend hours dancing with death, and though I try to extinguish these untimely visions, I'd have better luck stopping waves by the sea. It's so hard to describe the pain of existence from a dichotomous world of gender resistance when your body and soul don't even agree. The blackness will pass if I can sit tight, like thunderheads rumbling off into the night. I curl into the music and let it surround me. Images flow by in unrelenting streams, rippling unwanted like unstoppable dreams of pills and guns and crashing into a tree. The method can vary, but results are the same. My body lies crumpled, devoid of its fame, and my spirit slips away from the sad travesty. In the midst of this madness, a voice speaks my name. Lift up your pain, take your heart from the flame. I am with you right here in all that you see. As the requiem fades, my eyes open wide, and the tears that I cried have finally dried. I am back in this world, and from the dance, I am free. One more message came as my internal conflict reached a nadir on vacation with family in British Columbia. The sheer beauty of the Canadian Rockies did little to ease the darkness and despair within me from what I felt was the imminent demise of my marriage. One day we were out hiking in a large family group and had to cross a raging stream on a kind of cable car contraption in which there was room for just one person at a time. As the largest in the group, it was my lot to go last, with no one to hold the car while I climbed in. As I stretched one leg to get into the car while the other held firm on the ground, I had a flash of an image of how easy it would be to let myself slip and drown my sorrows in that stream. That momentary thought flashed by, and the next thing I knew, I was sliding across on the cable. A little while later, we were walking along a very steep, scree-covered slope. I continued to take up the rear, and when one foot slipped just a little, I had another flash that maybe I should let the other foot slide and go crashing, rolling down the slope. But some basic survival instinct took over, and I pulled myself back and followed the group down the mountain. That night, I hardly slept, and the next morning found myself in the darkest place yet. The other adults were going off on a hike, but they assumed I would not want to join them. The children and cousins all went down to a park in Caslow, and I found myself alone in the cabin in which we were staying. My mind kept replaying yesterday's near disasters, and I found myself wishing I had been a little less strong and just let myself slip into the stream or down that steep slope. These two episodes kept repeating over and over again, and with each replay, I found myself slipping deeper and deeper into depression. Finally, I managed to put the keys to our rental car in my pocket and went outside, deciding to drive down the lake to a spot with a hairpin curve and another precipitous drop, and see if that might end my agony. In my depressed state, I reasoned that throwing myself off the cliff would be one way to test the reality of the vision I had had during FLGC worship. Suddenly, though, an image flashed into my head of Jesus on the pinnacle of the temple, where the devil tempts him by saying, "Throw yourself down, for it's written, he'll give his angels charge of you." Stunned by this image, I sank down and sat for a moment in a patch of sunshine. Suddenly I heard, or more properly, felt, a warm, loving voice that said simply, "I am with you. I am always with you." With a huge sense of relief, I sat back in the summer sunshine and felt all my death wishes fade away. I knew suddenly I was accompanied on this path to authenticity. Indeed, by sinking down and trusting the seed, despite my fears and tears, I was taking a first step in understanding the obedience part of integrity. Let that grow in thee and be in thee and breathe in thee and act in thee. Since that time, I have made many changes, some legal, some surgical, and some spiritual. My first marriage ended with more tears, but finally, today, the hole that this trauma caused in my heart has healed. When I finally did come out to my children as Petra, Jessamine looked at me and said, "Can I still call you Daddy?" And I responded with a smile, "Yes, my dear, I will always be your father, but you will have to spell it with an I-E, not a Y. Daddy, D-A-D-D-I-E. But you might not want to call me that in the checkout line at Publix or in the women's restroom, because I'm not sure others will understand." I remember that Jessamine's response was to give me a huge hug. Daniel's equally loving response left me in tears. Now, a few years earlier, Daniel had had a complete meltdown. I think he was 5 at the time, after a long, or maybe 5, I think, after a long trip where he was kicking out and screaming. I just wrapped him up in my arms and held him. I whispered quietly to him, "Daniel, I love you. I will always love you, and there is nothing you can do to make me stop loving you. But now please stop hitting me and yelling." This unconditional love helped him to calm down and eventually get to sleep. So when I told Daniel I was going to start living as a woman called Petra, he just looked up at me and said, "Daddy, I love you. I will always love you. And there is nothing you can do to make me stop loving you." As the tears flowed, as they are now, I knew I was on the right path, with them at least. In 1998, I came out to my colleagues at FSU. And while there were some shocked faces, for the most part, the folks in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning were quite supportive. In January 1999, I began teaching as the woman I know myself to be, and that also went reasonably well. There were a few undergraduates who made deliberately hurtful comments on course evaluations, and there were a few confrontations with unruly students who said not very nice things, but these were for the most part quite limited. In 2001, I traveled to Montreal for the gender confirmation surgery that provided resolution to my gender dysphoria and even more peace. Once the hard shell that had protected the seed for so long finally cracked open, I have been able to feel a much closer connection with the divine. I have felt the stirrings of leadings much easier and with much less resistance on my part. I've developed a daily practice of prayer and meditation that begins with lighting a candle and seeking the silence within which I can sink down to the seed, which feels more fully open and accessible to me. At some point, I felt a leading that I should begin collecting images and sculptures of angels. I have created a special place, a prayer table that is now crowded with angels, as well as images of those that I love and cherish. I guess this is a way of giving visible thanks to the accompaniment I have felt on my journey, surrounded at critical times by one or more angels. By surrounding myself with these angelic images, I am more prepared if my memory or my spirit needs a refresher. I think the angels led me to New Mexico in 2003, where I was blessed to encounter another loving spirit during FLGC Midwinter Gathering in Ghost Ranch. When I had attended Midwinter and FGC summer gatherings previously, I always found the issue of having a roommate a bit difficult. I never knew who would be comfortable sharing a dormitory-style room with 2 single beds with a trans woman. Furthermore, most of the folks I knew well were already partnered, which made finding a roommate even more complex. At any rate, in January of 2003, I received an email from someone named Liz that I knew I had previously met, but quite frankly, I couldn't quite pull up her face. She said that our mutual friend, Deborah Fish, had suggested that I might need a roommate for the upcoming Midwinter Gathering at Ghost Ranch, and I was very happy to accept. After the evening program on our first night, We retired to our room and began sharing a bit of our history. It turns out that Liz was also suffering from a difficult breakup, and we shared the pain of our relationship woes. I felt such a deeply resonant connection that I knew this was someone I needed in my life. But she lived in Toronto and I in Tallahassee. How could this work? It turned out that she felt that same deep connection. And as we said goodbye after that long weekend, we each knew in our hearts that this was not really a parting, but a beginning of something wonderful. And it has been glorious. Later that same year in December, I had a message come through me in meeting for worship that I would like to share here. It came through as almost a complete message. Angels all around. Angels we have heard on high. All around I hear them sigh. Angels crying in our arms, reminding us to do no harms. Angels deep within the heart, teaching us to do our part. Angels filling each one's need by showing where our path must lead. Angels, angels everywhere, both on the earth and in the air. I have been truly blessed and want to use the remainder of this talk to share some of the ways that connecting to the seed has grounded my life and provided new vistas. My hope here is that this sharing may inspire others to find the courage to sink down to their seeds and connect more deeply to the divine. Thou shalt find by sweet experience that the Lord knows that and loves and owns that and will lead it to the inheritance of life, which is its portion. A trans identity is a difficult thing to own. The othering by society, with all its gender-based expectations, is so wounding for those of us who are gender nonconforming in any way. It is an unfortunate byproduct of the gender binary that is so deeply rooted in our culture that when people notice someone else whose gender seems different, they feel empowered to challenge anyone daring to violate the gender dichotomy, either in words or by direct physical threats. It is hard to be on the receiving end of such assaults, and I will not describe the numerous times that I have been on the receiving end of such intolerance, but it is always disturbing. These incidents cause a lot of pain, fear of loss, and becoming a pariah, and yes, I suppose some amount of guilt as well. Sometimes there are waves of pain penetrating deeply as I struggle not to internalize society's message about how freakish it is to be non-normative. There is an ongoing interior struggle to live into an identity that does not fit social norms, that causes a gnawing pain, that can only be relieved by embracing the light. I count myself one of the lucky ones who has managed to embrace the inheritance of life rather than remain trapped in a dark place. There is a kind of gender euphoria that comes with living fully as oneself, but the act of coming out often feels like a turning oneself inside out, bringing all the raw and tender inner workings into the light of day, visible and vulnerable to the world. And yet, while that vulnerability sometimes triggers a fear of unexpected consequence, I was beginning to discover that when I open myself more fully to the seed, there are deep reservoirs of strength. There is a quote from a lesbian activist poet named Audre Lorde that sums this up rather well. When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. One of the gifts that Liz has highlighted for me from early in our relationship is the gift of my voice. She has encouraged me to stop trying to sound like a woman. When you have a natural voice in the second bass range, the lowest of the male voices, it simply is not possible to project in a higher register. I tried taking voice lessons, and all the speech therapist could suggest to me was to change my speech patterns and sound less certain, sound more feminine, by ending all my sentences with a question. It sounds so feminine to talk like this, right? I sound so knowledgeable when I talk like this, don't I? Blech. I don't want my daughter or my female students to talk like this. So why should I? I think it was the next summer that I attended a workshop with Beverly Shepard and learned some of her chants. Some of you may be familiar with her chants thanks to the leadership of Cody and Rebecca, who have led chanting at SEYM. I have always loved to sing, but since my transition had silenced myself, since I felt very self-conscious of my deep voice. For me, it was very powerful to be encouraged to find my place in a chant, wherever my voice seemed comfortable. Having a small group of Quakers with whom to experiment with different harmonies felt very safe. But the words of the various chants also made deep connections to my journey. The following chant almost always leaves me in tears, since it captures so well the feelings I have had about being accompanied. It has also been an important part of my own healing process. I have heard thy prayers, I have seen thy tears. Behold, I will heal you. I have heard thy prayers, I have seen thy tears. Behold, I will heal you. Around this time, I also heard from my dear friend Susan Taylor that the Tallahassee a cappella community chorus had been formed, and they were looking for more tenor and bass voices. This group did regular performances in the community, and I was uncertain how the wider public would accept my gender non-conforming performance. But Susan persisted, dear Susan, and I agreed to go. When I got to my first rehearsal, Susan saw me and said, "Hey everyone, here's my friend Petra who wants to sing with us." The sopranos and altos both chimed in, "Hi Petra, come sit with us." I responded with my deepest voice, "Well, I should probably go sit over here with the other basses." No one batted an eye, and I sang with that choir for a number of years until our director took another position. In that group, I can honestly say I found my voice again, not just my singing voice, but my being out in public and not being afraid to speak voice. One day I was shopping in public several days after a public performance, and a young woman came up to me and told me she'd been at our concert and just wanted to share how much she loved my voice. That was important. One of the people who helped me reconceptualize my queer transness as a profound gift was a trans woman named Holly Boswell, from Black Mountain, North Carolina. Holly used to offer kindred spirits retreats near her home, and several times I joined in. I experienced powerful healing to hear Holly describe her transness as gender giftedness and ask questions like, how can we, as gender gifted folks, reclaim our identity as healers and even as spiritual leaders? Holly often used the term shamans and felt that our society was suffering from a gender phobia that clearly came from a place of great pain and ignorance. At Holly's prompting, I began reading about different traditional cultures, including indigenous groups in the United States that welcome trans people as two-spirited people. I felt such resonance when I learned that in most indigenous American tribal groups, adolescent boys and girls went on individual spirit quests. If a child who'd been born male had a vision in which they received cooking and sewing tools, they were acknowledged and welcomed back into the community among the other women of the tribe. Likewise, if a child was born female and had a vision in which they were given a tomahawk or a bow, they were welcomed as warriors and accepted among the other men of the tribe. These indigenous groups realized that gender difference was a gift of the Great Spirit. I found myself wondering if my earlier dream of the conveyor belt and my cliff vision were some kind of Western equivalent of a message from the divine. Thank you, Holly Boswell. May you rest in peace. These experiences prompted me to begin reading more widely. I found powerful writings by Leslie Feinberg and Kate Bornstein, whose titles alone, Transgender Warriors and Gender Outlaw, were intriguing. I had the opportunity to meet with each of them at various events at trans gatherings and was quite taken with their lives and witness. Could I too learn to live so out and proud as a gender nonconforming trans woman? When I was a deeply closeted trans person, I was unable to share and make connections from a deep place. But the essence of gender giftedness is that once the inner identity is unlocked, there is an immediate reconnection of so many disparate parts. At another FGC summer workshop by Laverne Shelton, I learned other language to describe what I was experiencing as opening up and connecting all the inner chakras. Others may be able to achieve this interconnectedness through other paths, such as meditation. But if you are gender blocked, very little gets through. Opening my deepest self to the world felt like an inner dam had broken, and I could suddenly feel again. When I worship with friends, when I chant, and when I spend time with other gender gifted folks, I often feel a reconnecting of all the chakras. This is at times a startling and almost overwhelming sensation, like the pins and needles after a limb has fallen asleep. I experience it as an intense tingling that runs up and down my spine repeatedly, bringing such renewal and such energy. The next challenge in reaping the harvest is finding ways to channel all that gifted energy as a part of my productive practice. The first step lies in acknowledging this gift from the divine and embracing it. For me, this acknowledgement changes the inner calculus of what should I say and how should I say it? Should I speak to this person or hold back because they might not approve of me and my identity? If I truly acknowledge that this gendered identity is from the divine, then being here and engaging in the world is part of that gift. I find it much easier now to engage in hard conversations about race, ethnicity, sexuality, and yes, certainly gender. The condition of vulnerability from my inside outness that I experience enables me to listen in different ways to the pain and experiences that others may be feeling. I think this is part of what Pennington calls the inheritance of life. Prior to my transition, I usually avoided these kinds of hard conversations because of my fear I would inadvertently reveal something of my deepest self. During my transition and revealing of the woman I knew myself to be, I had a very difficult time continuing in my previous line of academic research. Traveling internationally became something of an issue, not only because of the passport problem, but also because I was sure many of the places that I had worked previously would not be very happy to welcome a trans woman back into the professional capacity. So as I contemplated how I should move forward in my career, I had a clear leading that I should also transition my research agenda away from international planning and take as my primary focus the need to plan for cities and spaces that are open and inclusive of all genders and sexualities. When I shared this with my department chair, who's no longer at the university, he looked shocked and said, "That kind of work will never be publishable." But I felt I needed to persevere, and following this leading has in fact lifted what I had experienced as a writer's block in my earlier research focus. Soon publications were flowing like water. When I came out to the wider academic planning community, many were stunned, but generally they were quite supportive. It feels like part of my work now revolves around creating a space within the academy for other students and scholars to pursue the subjects they are led to study and not let themselves be silenced by the doubts of less aware administrators. I am so pleased that a number of young scholars are owning their difference and finding ways of integrating identity within their research. And in spite of my fears that following my path would cause me to lose my academic career, last year I traveled to California to receive the Dale Prize from Cal State Poly at Pomona in recognition of my contributions and for excellence in research on gender and sexuality. None of this would have happened if I had not followed the promptings of the seed. I hope others who are struggling will take heed and follow the leadings of their seeds. I also began finding myself called to be more visible and take more activist positions. Sometimes it is fear itself that keeps us from speaking our truths and witnessing that truth. In my case, part of reaping the harvest of the seed has given me much greater clarity that there remains work for me to do. When FGC's Committee on Nurturing Ministry on Racism came to Tallahassee, we organized a small silent witness against the Stand Your Ground law that the Florida legislature passed. Subsequently, I was invited to give a TED Talk on inclusivity that highlighted the importance of creating inclusive spaces in the cities we live so that all trans and non-conforming individuals can feel safer. 4 years ago, I felt another powerful leading to stand up, speak up, and be a beacon of love made visible. I was invited to give the keynote at the Tallahassee Women's March in January of 2017. It was an electric experience to stand in front of thousands of people crammed into a gym at Florida A&M because of a torrential downpour. As I shared my story, I felt such an outpouring of love and support. I want to share my closing words of that speech with you here to provide some encouragement in the troubling times that we find ourselves now. We must be loud and we must be proud and not back down in the face of tyranny and injustice. May each of you take courage, strength, and yes, a little steel in your backbone from our unity today. Take it back to your homes, take it back to your neighborhoods, take it back to your cities and towns. Be the change that you are called to be. I took my own message to heart and found myself accepting nearly every offer to speak out. When immigrants and Muslims were threatened by the Trump administration, I joined those rallies. When a young Black trans woman was murdered, I stepped up once more and spoke up, highlighting the unrelenting violence faced by all trans folks, but falling most heavily on trans women of color. I attended other rallies and events in support of making our world a more inclusive space. In short, I've made the focus of my work and witness the need to create more inclusive cities and spaces. One key to achieving this goal is in part to develop our ability as a society to listen empathically to each other. Violence and despair are often the result of feeling deeply unheard. Just as we must give over our willing, running, and desiring in order to sink down into the seed which God has sown in our hearts, we must trust that others who are different from us have that same capacity. Their inner journeys to seek the divine and their process for seeking down to the seed may look and feel different, but we must trust that our paths will converge in the end. As we enter into our closing silence in just a minute, perhaps we all might reflect on how the seed continues to work in each of us. I find the following quote from George Fox captures so well my experience that the Lord is at work in this thick night of darkness. Sing and rejoice, ye children of the day and the light, for the Lord is at work in this thick night of darkness that may be felt. And truth doth flourish as the rose, and the lilies do grow among the thorns, and the plants atop of the hills, and upon them the lambs doth skip and play. Thank you, friends.